Hello, everyone, and welcome to this keynote session titled Uptake on AI for Businesses That Are Not at Google Scale. You are watching us now from YouTube, so I encourage you to open the chat of YouTube to put your questions, put your comments, and make sure that I will take them all to ask them to our keynote speakers today just after the talk. But now let me introduce you to our speaker, Amin Mantrak. After graduating with a master's degree in computer science in 2003, Amin has stayed for 7 years at the ULB as a PhD researcher and has worked on automatic categorization and analysis on large-scale networks. In 2010, he left the academic world to join prestigious technology brands as a research engineer and scientist. Xerox in France, Yahoo in Spain and California, then Criteo in San Francisco. For 6 months now, he has been back in Europe and has been working for Amazon in Luxembourg. Today, Amin will tell us more about the challenges waiting ahead for companies that want to tap into the power of AI, though they are not one of the FANGs. Amin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maris, for this nice introduction. Thank you to the audience to be here. I want to thank AI for Belgium for this interesting invitation, for the program, the schedule that is very interesting. Today, in this session, we will be speaking about AI for businesses. And as you said, Maris, for businesses that are not at Google scale. So that's most of the entrepreneur, by the way, and most of the companies that are interested in AI. And what I will start with is to basically recall a bit my journey and what I have observed and how this observation speak to this talk. So what I've observed those last 10 years is that in the basically early 2010, AI was mostly a research field composed of a niche of professors and PhD students and people interested to research. And we have seen basically a move from that field to an engineering field. So AI now is really integrated into an engineering cycle of production with clear objective, milestones, teams, even though it's still very immature in some aspect if you compare to other engineering fields. And that's why we need those kind of sessions. That's why we need to have some discussion around it. So what I will try to share here is somehow some uptakes on what I think are the great opportunities for small businesses and entrepreneurs that are willing to leverage AI, especially because we are showing or we are witnessing interesting changes. Of course, AI is by nature changing very fast, right? You have to keep with the pace of it. But that said, there have been very interesting changes those recent years that are changing the game for entrepreneurs. Mostly, I want to focus on two aspects that some may be aware, some you may not be aware of, is what I'm calling the end of the technological barrier, and not the end of the data barrier, because the data is still a barrier if you want to enter the AI field, but there is a disruption in that area. So what I mean by the technological barrier, so to be back of what I was saying in 2010, only the big companies were playing and were able to productionize AI at scale. And one of the main reasons of that is that you needed a lot of investment in terms of technology to be able to build the infrastructure and also to support the cost that you needed to do that. And what we have seen those last years, and already 2015, I would say, is that the technology has became available to everyone. So there were no more, this barrier that used to be is not there anymore. Of course, there is a cost to pay for it. And we may come back to that during the discussion. But from an entrepreneur standpoint, that technology is available. That's a really big change. And as we will see during the talk, is that many companies, entrepreneurs are building on that aspect, on the end of the technological barrier. The other point I want to surface, and that's also very interesting, and that's something very, very new, I would say, mostly those recent years, is the disruption of the data barrier. What I mean by that, so we used to say that, in AI, you need a lot of data. The data is the goal of AI. And if you don't have data, you cannot really enter that field. And somehow that created a kind of inequality between the companies and the big actors that are sitting on a mine of data versus the new players that do not have access to the data. What we have seen recently is that this is a bit changing thanks to the last advancement in AI, which somehow we are able now to provide you some brain, let's call it brain, or some models that are integrating already some knowledge, right? A knowledge that for which you don't have to pay the price in terms of data or even in terms of computation power. So that's also a big changes. And as we will see in examples, new companies are already taking advantage of that. So I will illustrate this through two examples. So the first, let's go back to the end of the technological barrier, and I will look deeply at the advertising industry. Why the advertising industry? It's mostly because that's the first, maybe one of the first industry that have been able to monetize AI. So that's interesting to have a look at it and how the advertising industry that is one of the most mature in terms of AI, why even that industry has been concerned by the technological barrier break, and how new actors have tried and have been very successful at it to build on the end of the technological barrier to come and compete with the main actors in that field. And so let me start by explaining how the advertisement work online. So usually we used to have we had the printed press, and the printed press was monetized, and it's still nowadays monetized through advertisement. And in the printed industry, in the printed digital industry, usually the advertisement worked through contract or settlement. What happened is that the big newspapers, the big media outlets will negotiate a deal with big advertisement agency to sell a number of impressions through contract. And early on, the early companies that started, the media online, mainly AOL and Yahoo, right, in the early 2000s, they also adopted the same monetizing scheme, right, which is through contracts. But they very quickly realized that going through contract was not the best way to monetize basically the opportunities. And they realized that through the internet and with programmatic, we could achieve better revenue for them. So quickly, they imagine a setup where you could sell real-time the opportunity through an auction. And this is what's happening today still online. So when you have an advertisement opportunity, here I'm speaking about, for instance, LinkedIn. Let's say you are in LinkedIn, and on LinkedIn, you sometimes see promoted content. And so how this content appear to you is, first, LinkedIn will reach to a real-time bidding platform, and that platform will try to sell that opportunity online for you. So it will contact different advertisers and ask them, are you willing, right, to put a promoted content here? And for instance, the real-time bidding platform might reach to Google, to Facebook, to RTB House. We will come back to the case of RTB House that used to be a very small startup in the field. And they will ask, okay, how much do you value that opportunity? And this is where the AI come into into the play. Let's say that Facebook say, I value 1 cent the opportunity, Google 1.2 cents, and RTB House 1.5 cents. So here, RTB House is the winner because he has the highest bid. So he will take the other opportunity. He may decide to, for instance, promote one of his customers. Let's say that AI for Belgium is a customer of RTB House, and then they promote this afternoon event. So they put this ad, and let's say that Nat come into the play and see that advertisement. He likes it. He go on the website of AI for Belgium. He register, and when that registration happened, basically AI for Belgium is paying RTB House $5. And at the end, the profit of RTB House is $5 because they have been able to monetize that ad opportunity, and they buy it for 15 cents minus the internal cost. So what is interesting to understand is your ability here to value the opportunity and to balance your ability to sell or to not sell. This is where the AI come into play. And this kind of game here that's happening online requires a lot of resources. So it requires an AI, of course, to be able to value the opportunity, but you need to be able to serve very quickly your customers. You need to be able to have the infra to do so. So that kind of stuff, what you wouldn't be able to do that except if you were a very big companies, I would say around the early 2010 up to 2015. But thanks to the advancement of the break of the technological barrier, and mostly the fact that we have seen cloud as a services coming in and software as a services coming in, actually what happened is RTB House have been able to build on this kind of dynamic to serve their customers. So and this is where RTB House, for instance, in that use case differs from the competitors, is that the competitors were already established in that field, and somehow they built their own technology, right? And it took for Google 5 to 10 years to do so. And interestingly, through the cluster, through the fact that the state-of-the-art AI model for this kind of for the advertising also became well documented, open source, and available. So the combination of all those together make the small businesses, give them the ability to enter that field. What I want also to surface is that taking the opportunity of the cloud and software as a service is not something that puts you behind. Actually, the big leaders and the big actors of the tech industry, I'm citing here Netflix, Spotify, GitLab, all of them are taking opportunity of the cloud in the cloud, right? And the service available. Of course, there is a question of cost, but here what I want to surface is the beyond above the cost, the technology is available and you can make use of it. And that's why in the case of RTB House, of course, RTB House announced in 2017 that they are bringing a breakthrough, to marketers through deep learning in the specific field of real-time bidding. But the big advantage, I would say, was not the ability to deliver deep learning or the modeling, but really the ability that they saw the opportunity to build on this technological barrier break, and to directly and with, of course, a good marketing strategy, with a good agility to be able to go there and to compete with the big actors. So that's the first example I wanted to deliver about the fact that this kind of break is offering opportunities to the industry and to here very small company like RTB House. Another example that I found also very interesting, and it relates now to the data barrier. So I wouldn't say there is a break because there is still a data barrier, but we see that some things are changing, evolving very fast. And I want to illustrate that through Pixcleaner.com. So Pixcleaner, it's actually two entrepreneurs that created this website, and they are basically in the field of something very well known actually right now, which is background removal of images. And that's very important for the e-commerce industry, for the fashion industry, because as you load your images on the internet, you may need, most of the time, you will need to do a background removal of the image, and you will need to adapt the image. And some years ago, that was not possible to do at the level of production of what a product will require. So it was a lot of manual work, and now AI is reaching the point where you can do that somehow at scale, and you can reach the level of industry requirement. But the question is here, how is it possible for two guys to be able to enter that field? Why is it possible? It's mostly one of the big barriers was the access to the data. So usually if you wanted to train a model in computer vision, and that's the same thing for NLP. So here, that's one example, but it's the same thing for NLP. If you wanted to enter that field, you needed a lot of data collection and a lot of annotation effort. And that was very costly for segmentation, for, you know, to be able to learn good representation for images. You need to extract that images, to clean them, to annotate them, and that was a huge cost. And what's happening right now is what we are seeing is the emergence of pre-trained models. That's okay. It happened already some years ago in the computer vision industry, and now way more those recent years in NLP, in the natural language processing industry. And that's a big game changer. Why is it a big game changer? It's because you don't need the data anymore. You don't need to do the annotation sometimes anymore, because the model is pre-trained for you, and you don't even need to train it. And sometimes the training would cost huge amount of money. I mean, a normal company cannot afford to train a model for months and pay in the $100,000 or million of dollars to train models. That's really too much. But nowadays, those models are being made available and actually free. And that's a big game changer, because it means that it creates a lot of opportunities for businesses. Even if you don't have the data, you can already start from pre-trained models. And then the amount of effort you will need and you will spend in annotation will be considerably reduced. We have seen a very big change in that specific field, and a lot of incredible opportunities, either in computer vision, in natural language processing. I would speak about, for instance, translation. Many companies trying to now provide services for translations in specific domain, or in the legal field, for instance, or in the health field, and so forth and so on. And so what's important to understand is that this change bring a lot of opportunities. I'm giving the example of Hugging Face. Hugging Face is a very interesting company that most of AI practitioners know about, and that is building on top of both use cases, the technological barrier break, and also the data barrier break. And somehow they are providing now those kind of pre-trained models for free, and also they build services on top of them. And you can of course make use of those services. So it depends on your buying power. You can decide to go for the buying options or not of Hugging Face. And so now the question is how to make your business benefit of those things, right? We have seen that there are interesting changes, important changes. How does that matter for your business? So before actually replying to that question, I think it's important to distinguish between two kinds of businesses, because the dynamic is different and the challenges are different. The first kind of business, I would say, are startups or AI-driven companies. So a company that has been founded with a clear objective that is basically turning around AI. And that's the case of RTB House, for instance. That's the case of Pixcleaner, for instance. And that's the case of many companies. And in that case, scaling AI is a very different question than when we look at established businesses, because an established business is not necessarily AI-based. And before investing in AI, there are a lot of interesting questions that need to be replied, right? You cannot link the both directly. What I'm focusing here on is, and maybe we should have some critics about this study. So there have been an interesting study done by Accenture on 1,500 C-level executive among different organizations across 16 industry, different countries. And what they are surfacing is the fact that they are seeing two clusters of company. The first cluster they call the proof of concept factory is basically those companies that are stuck in building proof of concept, but have troubles to scale them to AI. And the other kind of companies are basically strategically scaling company, what they call the top 15, 20%. Where I'm a bit critic, I have some critique about this study, is that they mostly, they look at the strategy scaling factor like CEO and executive directly implied in the strategy of the company. Fair enough, it makes sense, but that's also the case actually if you look to Pixcleaner or RTBRs, small companies. So of course they are directly aligned with the AI strategy. Where I would be more critics is the necessity to be in a multidisciplinary team of 200 people and so on. So I don't think that AI, scaling AI necessarily require that amount of effort, and it's basically the privilege of just big companies. Of course, I think here the study is biased toward established businesses. And then in that case, if we speak about established businesses, then I would tend to agree that the changing an established business from the way it operates to being able to scale AI will require a lot of effort. And that in that sense, this is what the Accenture study is telling us. So one of the important points, why this matters for your business, there are interesting questions, and what you see in blue are the replies, so the answers from the US companies. In purple is the worldwide answers, and those are very interesting numbers. The first thing is, what you can see is after studying and speaking with the 1,500 C-level executive, you can see that 88% of them say that they won't achieve their growth objective without scaling AI, which means somehow that it's an indication factor that the market has already sized AI in the objective of most of those companies. And now the market is expecting those companies to bring growth through AI. Maybe they are over-promising, but this is a matter of fact. The second point, and that's something I think that is worrisome, is that 71% basically of those executives say that if they don't integrate or scale AI in the next 5 years, they will be out of business. So that's pretty alarming, which means that somehow even established companies should be aware of this. And the third point is that even though those executives say they know how to pilot, they kind of recognize and acknowledge that they have problem to basically scale AI across the business. So what is important to think here is that even if you're an established company, you cannot really ignore AI, because somehow it's entering in your field and it will put your business under pressure and under competition. And this is across most of the industry. So what you see here is that we have tendency to say higher the investment, higher the return on investment in AI, but actually that depends on your industry and where you fall in that picture. So this is a Deloitte plot and study, and what you see is while the tech industry is somehow claimed to be at least very good in integrating AI and taking return investment out of it, if you look at the other industry, for instance, the health industry, there seem to be a lot of investment, but the return is not yet there. And if you look at the public sector, it seems to be, the investment is low and not yet there. So it means also that there are opportunities, and there will be more and more opportunities for those industries to integrate AI. But the real question is how it will be done. And so now what I want basically to transfer to is to give some insight of what basically I think should be the most important point to take care and to be aware of in order to execute this kind of AI integration, and in order to be sure that you're able to leverage AI and that you don't make mistakes that many companies and maybe projects are falling in. So the first insight that I call insight zero here is that even before starting, do your homework. That seems kind of obvious, but why I want to say that is I've observed that most of the time, and when you are in the industry, you see that, okay, sometimes some projects are failing or some projects are not basically delivering what they promised. But most of the time when they fail is because they didn't analyze properly what were the risks. And if you, of course, it's easy to say afterwards that when you analyze, you realize, okay, those kind of risks could have been captured, we could have control for that, but we didn't do the homework properly. And that's also related to the fact that AI is still a new field in terms of, I would say, engineering part. In terms of project management is still a new field, and therefore people are not necessarily as aware of risk management as they are, for instance, in the construction industry. So when you start building a new project, if you're a constructor manager, you have clear guidelines and you know what you should look at, what you shouldn't look at, right? When it comes to AI, it's still, I would say, not necessarily a gray zone, but there are still a lack of mastership and a lack of understanding sometimes. So that's why I would say first you need to be sure why you want to invest in AI. This question seems obvious, but I've seen sometimes people sizing projects with promise or with ideas that AI will leverage something, but it was not very clear why it would. And so you need to be sure that okay, this is your metric, this is your ROI that you want for your customer or for your business, and you should have a clear reply on why this specific AI project is gonna to bring value. Also, make clear your plan. So have an open plan in a written document, make people aware of this plan, make people document the plan. That's very important because this is how sometimes you will be aware of some feasibility blockers. Here I'm citing the three most common blockers that I've seen. The first one is the fact that you don't have the infra available, or you are not willing or to support the cost, or actually you didn't size the cost correctly. So it happened many times that, okay, the project is great, the plan is great, but when it comes to execution, realize that, okay, we needed way more computation power than what we thought. It requires more effort than what we thought. And that's sometimes a problem, because then people realize, oh, we cannot invest that much into this project. We didn't expect this. And then the project stopped. And the same thing, sometimes the projects are not sized in a pessimistic scenario. Most of the time they are sized in an optimistic scenario. And then the project takes more time than it was supposed to take. And that's where you have to, so people have to be very aware to size the project correctly. Also, do you have the data needed and available? That seems obvious, but it's not as obvious as it is. So sometimes when you start a project, you think you will do that, it's gonna to work, but if you don't have the data to do that, then you need to start collecting the data. But if you start collecting the data, you may be delayed by 3 months, 6 months, and then the project doesn't work, right? So this is kind of obvious stuff, but that you need to surface before you start. Sometimes there are legal issues about the data, or ethical issues about the data, especially now with the GDPR, or the Californian Act and so on. So you have to also sometimes be sure from a legal perspective that what what you are sizing and what you are thinking about makes sense. Okay, that was insight zero. So my first insight now, once you started your project, would be I think that should be the main objective along any kind of AI project, would be to close the gap between your KPI and your AI. What I mean by closing the gap between the KPI and the AI, most of the time, you know, the executive and the managers of the company, they have clear metrics which speak to the company. For instance, it can be the final, let's say you are doing advertisement, so you want to increase the final revenue in terms of selling advertisements. Maybe you want to do new customer acquisition. So those are the KPIs of your company. And then the AI is something different. The AI is there to learn and to leverage data, but the goal is you want to exploit that data to improve your KPI. And most of the time there is a gap between both things. So what the AI is able to leverage will not necessarily align directly with your KPI. It may be something close to it, but it's not necessarily the same case. Here I'm giving the example of, let's say you want to learn a model that is able to discriminate between click advertisement and non-click advertisement, and you use this kind of scoring to bid online, right? Maybe it can work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that will improve your revenue, right? And you need actually through different experiment and live experiment to iterate and to reformulate your assumptions in order to come with an AI metric, so an optimization problem that will align with your KPI, which means that, for instance, you may give more importance to specific customers, or you may want to give more importance to specific ads. So it depends on what is your problem, but you have to be aware that you have to close the gap between your AI and your KPI, and to do so, it requires a lot of live experiments, lot of observation. It requires to go deep in the data to analyze what's going on, and that requires time. So that leads us to the next step. But if you are not doing that, most of the time what happened, and for instance, I have this story of a recommendation project I was working on, is that it took us a long time to be able to have an AI that will align with the KPI. And if you do typical deep learning, most of the time when you do deep learning, you come with toolboxes that are already there to optimize for specific functions, but doesn't necessarily align with your KPI. So it required us time to iterate through many offline and life cycle experiments to at the end reach a point of what I would call an inflection point, so a point of where suddenly you start saying, okay, wow, the AI model now is really aligned with our KPI objective, and now we start having this virtuous cycle where we start seeing interesting improvement. Okay, now we move to the next insight, the second one or the third one, which is about taking your time and make sure that you are taking time and taking long term. So this relates also to the previous point. You have to be aware that when you start a project, and it depends where you lies into. So it depends of whether your company has a huge experience with AI and they already have been, they are used to the full cycle and the production cycle of AI, or you are starting from scratch. If you are starting from scratch, don't think that you will be able to leverage AI in 3 or 6 months. And this relates to the proof of concept problem, which means building a model like data scientists do, or like people in the academy do, it's not because you see improvement in a specific offline data that this relates to what you will expect in a production environment. So there are a lot of things that you need to do from an engineering standpoint, from building the pipelines, for having the team available in terms of scientists, in terms of managers, in terms of aligning, as I said, your ROI with your KPI. So all those things require time, and you need to make sure that somehow your company is aware of that, because if you are not in that setting, that setting is not in your mind, you may or you may overpromise and undersize, right? And we come back to the first key insight. So be aware of that. So to finish, then my last point here, and that's something I've seen again and again, is do not reinvent the wheel. Why I'm saying that? Because, okay, most of the software engineers, I tend to believe that they are biased into rebuilding from scratch. So they like rebuilding from scratch. They like analyzing what doesn't work and propose a new solution. But most of the time, you should dedicate your time to what is your final objective for your KPI or your customers, meaning focus on that and try to avoid putting a lot of time in rebuilding the wheel, in rebuilding the infrastructure, in doing size projects that are not really related to your business. Of course, that means that try to rely on cloud services when possible. Of course, you have a cost there, but keep in mind that the time that you spend somehow outside of your main objective is a time that will create fatigue, and it's a time also where you will have less time to deliver and leverage on your AI project. With that, I think I'm done. So thank you for your attention, and we are ready to take the questions.
Thank you for this very interesting keynote, Amin. Let's use the panel to dig into the practical side of the topic and contrast the theoretical figures that you show with what can be observed in Belgian companies in different sectors. The field perspective will be brought by Sabri Skiri. Sabri is another fellow of the ULB. For 12 years now, he has been the R&D director of Uranova, leading research teams and supervising dozens of projects with clients where innovation and time to market were key factors in market differentiation and business successes. So, first question for you guys. In the presentation, we saw a very interesting figure. 80 to 85% of the companies would be stuck in the proof of concept phase. Sabri, how can you explain this? What are the main showstoppers for companies?
Yeah, thank you, Marie. It's a very interesting question. So, as you said, I've been driving a lot of data-driven projects, and that's true that it's always the same story again and over again. You start a proof concept, you get an extract of your data, you take some kind of fancy technologies such as Apache Spark or any other open source AI library, and you quickly show the value to the CXO level. But then you start thinking about deploying production. And then you realize that you are falling short in terms of data governance. You don't really know where the data comes from, the data you get in your extracts. You don't really know where are the master data. You don't really know the lineage, the different processing step applied to the data. And you realize that your data are located in many different silos in your enterprise. And you realize that you don't have any strategy for integrating, collecting, storing, distributing, and managing your data. And finally, you realize that the tech stack that you have in production is completely different from the one you use in proof concept. And then you need to think about, well, maintaining production, hiring people, having the skills for at least deploying and running these kind of things. So for all this reason, I believe that the proof concept does not necessarily represent the data management maturity of your company.
Thank you. Second question. In the presentation, Amin mentioned that we absolutely need to get the proper infrastructure in place, and you suggested to leverage the cloud services as much as possible, Amin. However, don't you think that even though the cloud enables to lower all the burden of maintenance and run of these clusters, it still involves a high TCO for a company starting from scratch? What's your take about that, Sabri?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I think the cloud is just fantastic. You know, it allows you to quickly start deploying and building things. It provides you components and framework. But at the end of the day, you still need to integrate, first of all, to pick and choose which component you need and to integrate all of them. Let me take just a short example. So let's imagine you would like to build a data hub on Azure cloud, for instance. Well, first of all, you will need to think about which component can be used for connecting your data source, how you're going to design the landing area, or if you would like to ingest in real time, how are you going to use Event Hub? And then if you would like to store the data, well, you need to pick and choose which component or which element you will use for storing your data. How are you going to integrate that with Event Hub and with your landing area? For the consumption layer, how are you going to expose your data? Are you using a Databricks Delta, just Spark, Azure Data Fabric? There is many different ways then to expose and to consume your data and to think about the end-to-end integration. Of course, in terms of maintenance and running costs, it's much lower than if you exploit it yourself. However, it does not necessarily mean a zero TCO. So at least you need to have your own data architecture, integration architecture, and still into your dream team to have the right skill sets.
Of course. And talking about that, in the talk, we learned that getting the right team is an important step in scaling the AI in business. We heard about AI scientists, ML engineers, data engineers. Is it too challenging for a business that is not Google to find and hire these profiles? I mean, finding, okay, who am I to hire and where can I find them and how to assess them? What's your take about that? I mean,
Well, I think you're fully right on this. That's very challenging. And that relates to one of my experience. So I used to work for Criteo in the States, in the heart of the Silicon Valley. And it was very, very hard for them to hire. I would even say it was impossible because you are competing with the biggest company worldwide. But they were able to hire top people in Paris. Why? Because they had a name, they had a good brand in Paris, they had good collaboration with the local university like INRIA and so forth. So I would really, I think it was a great strategy, and I would suggest for Belgian companies to the extent they can do that, to build very nice collaboration with the local universities and the local academics, and build a brand. It takes time, but it's not because you are not known in the US or not known in another part of the country that you cannot be an excellent actor in the local area.
nice point. And you, Sabri, what could you say about that?
Well, I think it's a really challenging point actually. So you know, at Uranoa, we have been hiring data scientists for many years. So we've seen a huge number of CV, and sometimes it's really weird to see some people claiming they are data scientists because they have made some pre-processing in SQL, and they're data scientists on CV. So I think it's really difficult for people, for companies starting from scratch, to be able to assess the skills and the real skills of people. And that's where I believe data advisory company like us could play a role there, like us or like any other in this week, can play a role here for helping building this kind of team, assessing the skills, and really having this knowledge transfer to the company.
Okay. And now let's say that we get our dream team for AI and data engineering. They start working and everything goes well. However, the technology in this area evolves very fast. In the past 5 years, the entire data analytics landscape completely changed. Similarly, in the AI community, we see thousands of newspapers featuring new approaches every year. So my question for you, Amin, is how can businesses deal with this fast-paced environment, and do they need to?
Well, that's a great question. I would say yes, they need to, because it depends if you focus on short term or long term. You can be very good, in your specific domain, but if you, I would come back to the example of the AI, the AI industry. So many companies now are actually challenged a lot because there is huge change in the AI, in the advertising industry happening. That big change is there will be no more third-party cookie very soon, which means that the way people used to exploit data so far are not gonna work anymore in 1 or 2 years from now, and that create new challenges. So we have seen already new models in terms of federated learning happening, and new kinds of modeling appearing. And therefore, if you are a company in that specific field of advertising industry, you better be aware of that, and better have scientists already working on this. So that's for this specific use case. But I would say that it's better for your company to be aware, especially if they are in a domain where things are changing and they are really AI driven. You need to somehow design your objectives in terms of integrating what's happening in science lastly. So that means visiting conferences, being aware of the latest state of the art. Make sure that your company value science, and give time to your employee to look around and try to integrate the last technology. It doesn't mean that you should expect, of course, a return on investment immediately, but it's good for you to have a temperature of what's happening, and try to keep the bar.
Okay, thank you. We still have 7 minutes for our attendees' questions. So let's start with the first one from Timo K. What kind of profile should be looked for to hire to help set up AI integration for a small company? How can they start? With what kind of profile should they start the setup of AI integration?
So I would say that you need a person, of course, that has an experience in the AI industry, that have already done so, that have been working in different projects, and that have a record of doing that in companies. So I mean, the experience should speak for itself. So there is I wouldn't say what matters is the degree, but mostly to have a record of industrial experience. I don't know what Sabri think about this.
Well, yeah. So I think that there is really two sides of the question. The first is clearly on the modeling side, and of course, I mean, it's completely right. You need someone having experience in developing model, and what Amin explained during the keynote is very true, actually, very correct. You need to have this ability to understand the business KPI to be able to model the right things. And then you need someone being able to deploy that in production, to be able to have all the pipelining of your data. And this is what Amin called the data engineer, to be able to pipelining everything, to run these things and to maintain these things. And I think this is the two mandatory profile you need to have. Of course, depending of the size of the company, you don't need to have perhaps one full-time employee for doing that. Depending of the size of the data, the size of the company, your volume, it could be adapted. But I think this is the two minimum profile to get.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the both of you. And Flogo is asking, do you think it is possible and necessary for small companies to really understand how AI achieves certain results? So what can we think about black box versus explainability? Gabriel?
That's a great question. Well, I would say that in practice, most of the time, so it depends on the business. Explainability may be a requirement. Let's speak about the case of recommender systems. You better know why you are recommending something to someone. especially, we have a lot of fairness issue right now in AI and other issues where you better know why you are recommending things. So I think that people are coming back from the black box area, and explainability is something more and more important. But of course, I can imagine that for some other areas, if you are building a control model for fly or whatever for flight, or if you in some other areas you don't really care about explainability. So there is no black and white answer here, but yes, this would be my answer.
Okay, Sabri, do you want to say something about
so
it?
I tend to agree with. I mean, it really depends of the business. Which is really cool today is that a few years ago, explainability was only for a certain type of model that we can explain. So now even black box model can be explained by some algorithm, and you can find open source library for doing that. Even on Azure and even on Amazon, you can find this kind of framework. And explainability here can help you explain which features or which attributes can influence the decision of your algorithm. And even if you don't need it, it's always interesting to check that with some people who knows the business, to be sure that, well, to check whether the model behaves correctly, or if there are some overlearning on specific things. And that's always interesting to get this, at least this insight. So even if it's not mandatory, because for a legal point of view or not, or any other things, it's always interesting to get this view of why this model behave like this, in order to be able to customize it, to improve it, or just to understand it.
Okay.
And it could be done at lower cost today.
Nice. Okay, the last question for the 2 last minutes is very practical, in fact, from Timo K again. What are the alternative means to using cloud services such as Google, AWS, to avoid getting vendor locked and want more power over custom ML solutions? In which cases would this be viable?
Okay. Well, I would say honestly, it depends at your scale. So if you're an established company, I can imagine that you maybe have already, big infra, and you can try to leverage it, which means that the cost you will need to pay is to build your own infra. That could work depending on your use case, right? You don't necessarily need to leverage, big AI in production. I also say, and I haven't spoken about this in this talk, but you maybe are not in the use case of big data. So many people think they have big data, but sometimes they don't have big data. So many use cases could be actually developed on your own laptop, and you maybe don't need to have a big infra. So that's the first point. Maybe you don't have big data, so you don't need a big infra. Maybe you can leverage your infra that you already have. But when it comes to startup and companies that are that are AI driven and starting from scratch, I would say it will be particularly difficult to rebuild. It will be a waste of time and of cost of money to invest when you start, at least when you are starting. So it depends really on which kind of company you are.
Okay. Thank you for your answer, Amin, and thank you to the both of you for the keynote, for the panel. Thank you to all attendees for the questions and the attentions. I wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, and see you in the next session of this AI week.
Thank
Good
you,
afternoon, everyone, and thank you.